some indies take for granted. They think, oh, well, I'll feed them a video ad and then I'll feed them a permission ad and then I'll feed them a buy ad and we're good. It's like,
no, doesn't work like that.
Yeah, no, you don't want your entire relationship with your fans to be centered around ads. I mean, here at Indepreneur, we are obviously very pro ads, and we know that advertising is an investment that you really need to make, right? Organic is not going to get you there on its own, but it's still very, very important as a support structure for the ads that you're running.
You are now listening to the Creative Juice podcast, brought to you by Indepreneur.io.
What's up, indies? Welcome back to Creative Juice. I am your host, Corinne Campbell, and with me, as always, is my co-host, Jack. How you doing today, Jack?
I am doing fantastic. How are you?
Fan-freaking-tastic.
Awesome.
We have a lot to cover today, so I'm going to dive right into this. Last week, we talked a little bit about how we are looking at different artists and their ecosystems, and especially with Jack, as many different types of artists and, size of audiences that he's dealing with. This was great insight. So when we were brainstorming about what to talk about this week, we were thinking it could be good, say that you've got all this stuff running and your audiences are good and you've got your buddy system all, great, and you set on a campaign and it flops, right? And maybe it's not doing what you expect. And I think something that we talk about a lot at Indepreneur, a question we get constantly is, what kind of cost per blank is good? Cost per 75% view, cost of lead, cost of, any kind of variable thing. And it's like, I know we pay with money, and so that's why we're thinking about these things. But at the same time, I thought it would be helpful for us to talk about things outside of the realm of the almighty penny that help us determine what's actually working and what's not. And when you look at it with a more critical kind of thinking instead of these benchmarks, you're able to figure out where you might need to go in a different direction or what isn't working so that you can make these changes in a more intelligent way. So, I'm sure, Jack, for you at IndieX, you're pivoting constantly with different campaigns.
For sure. Yeah. And I think, like you said, a lot of times, as musicians, as marketers, we tend to focus in on one KPI and hone in on it, whether it's cost per 75% view for top of funnel things, or whether it's cost per lead for, permission stage stuff, or cost per acquisition for conversions and purchases. And I think it's easy to get stuck in kind of the weeds of figuring out why your one KPI isn't working, and not zooming out and looking at the big picture of, okay, what are the other variables that I need to look at here, and why do they matter to the result that I'm driving towards? So yeah, that's something that we're always looking at.
Yeah, and it's, we try to put these benchmarks out there, and especially if you are an experienced marketer, you might have a wider scope with which to evaluate those costs, right? And so if you're kind of new, or you've only really run ads for yourself, you're not really going to have that kind of perspective to know, like, okay, well, what's the standard for this kind of thing in these circumstances at this time, right? So that's why I thought it was really important that we talk about something that is not about the cost, because we see plenty of artists who, like we like to say, like, oh, if you're paying like $1 a lead, that's great. Some artists pay $2, some artists pay up to $5 per lead. And that doesn't necessarily mean that what they're doing isn't working. It just means that maybe their audience is more expensive, and we can look at these other things. Or maybe you're getting leads for 60 cents. But that doesn't necessarily mean it's doing as well as it could, right? And so by bringing in these other elements, we're able to kind of, teach you guys more about how to critically think about these things instead of using that dollar. Because the thing is, even if you're thinking about the dollar, it's still distracting you from identifying what is broken about it, right? All you know is that it costs too much. And if that's all you know, because that's what you're looking at, then, it just doesn't give you a lot of call to action to figure out how to fix it. So we're going to go over that a little bit today. We'll go through a couple of different stages, right? A lot of indies are running ads for, fan finder, right? Introduction, that top of funnel, as we call it. And then they're running opt-in campaigns for permission. So whether that's, they're running ManyChat, subscriber ads, or email collection with landing pages, those kinds of permission campaigns are something that a lot of indies get stuck in. And then affirmation, those first sales offers, right? Which a lot of that does happen organically, but some of that should also be happening, with ads and with ad support. So we're going to go over all of these today to kind of identify the things that need to, just kind of be thought about as you're making these adjustments and judging whether or not a campaign is doing well.
Yeah, I think it's going to be really cool just to kind of dive into it and look into campaigns at all of these stages of the buddy system that we're talking about today. And not only look at the metrics for, each kind of those campaigns and things you might look for, pivots that you can make, but also using that kind of that high level critical eye to determine, okay, maybe I have to go back a step. Maybe I have to go back to, for example, if you're struggling at the permission stage and a campaign just is not doing what you want it to do despite all your best efforts and your pivots, maybe there's reason to believe, okay, maybe I need to go back and look at my education stage and see what's happening there and why it's not pre-framing people to go the next step with me. So I think that that's something important that we'll cover as well.
Absolutely. So let's kind of dive into just a top layer view of this. So Jack, if I'm having trouble with an ad, right? And say it's for, without getting into specifics, right? What are the elements of an ad, no matter what the objective? What are the elements that we first look to when something's not doing what we're expecting?
Yeah, sure. Well, I mean, there's two elements of an ad that I would say, or really three elements of an ad that I would say you could look at first and foremost, kind of as your biggest areas. One is your ad creative, the images or the videos that you're using in the ad. The second is the ad copy, how you're putting the ad out to people, what you're saying to them, the messaging associated with that creative. And the third place is the targeting. Who's the audience that you're trying to put this in front of? Those are kind of the three big areas, right?
Right. Yeah. And, for me, typically when I'm evaluating something to see whether or not it's working and it's not working, I assume firstly, if it's with a cold audience, I assume that it's probably the creative. And if it's with a warm audience, I'm assuming it's the audience. You know what I mean?
Yep.
That maybe the audience isn't big enough, right? Or that it's not warmed up enough, right? So with cold audience, it can be a combination of things, but as long as you're using audiences that are of big enough size, it's likely not as much the audience as that your content is not compelling to that audience. So is it a problem with the audience or a problem with the content? And without doing some testing, you're not going to know. So, but those are the things I think a lot of people, when they're looking at why their ads are failing, they assume that it's just the ad. But in a lot of situations, especially when indies are doing anything but a fan finder, it's the audience, right? There's something that's not warmed up enough or fine-tuned enough about the audience that you're running to. So that's one thing that I really kind of wanted to, touch on before we dig into all of these specifics, because you really need to be looking at all three of those facets to make sure that you don't just make a whole bunch of sudden changes and realize that maybe that wasn't what you should have done in the first place.
Definitely, yeah. And there's an element of wanting to, while I often recommend testing, big, broad changes, that doesn't necessarily mean testing all of your variables differently. I have a lot of indies that come to me and they say I think, for my fan finder campaign, I'm just not targeting the right people. In reality, you're probably, unless you're, wildly off about what you think your music sounds like and who you think would like it, it's probably more, if your top of funnel campaign isn't working, it's probably more indicative, like you said, Corinne, that the content just isn't resonating, not the targeting.
Right, exactly. And, something else, I'd be interested to what you think about this, Jack, but a lot of times when I am not sure, when I'm getting into a campaign for my audience, whether it's with the fan finder, obviously, if you've gone through our fan finder training, that we're okay, run these AdSense against each other. to figure out what audience is going to work best for you, right? But another kind of set of variables, especially with warm audiences, that I like to do is to, instead of being like, well, why don't I throw this up and see if it works, right? Especially if, we were talking with an indie in the Indie Pro group. I guess I was talking to him a couple of days ago, and he was like, I know this video isn't to spec for FanFinder, but do you think this would work? And he posted something that, they didn't make it specially for this kind of campaign. They wanted to see what worked. And I've mentioned on this podcast like multiple times that my stupid lyric video that should not work for some reason works, right? So, but the thing that I found would have been valuable, like looking back on it, is like if I tested that video against other things at the same time, like in real time, instead of like, putting something out there, seeing if it works or doesn't, and then trying to make some kind of judgment based on these random benchmarks, right? That have nothing to do with your brand.
Right.
Trying to figure out if like that's a good result. Like I can turn on that FanFinder right now and get, 10 to 13 cent cost on 75% view, which by all, accounts is a good performing video, even though it's a lyric video. But I find that the follow-up to that video is very difficult, right? And so when it boils down to getting people's emails and getting them to buy things, the costs are much higher on the back end of that. So, and if I'm not running against something directly, I don't know that. I don't know that something else could perform even better than that, because as you run things at different times to different audiences, like you're not actually getting a good test of variables. So Jack, am I off on that? Like when you're running things at the agency at all these levels, like how do you try to test out things? Do you just post one thing and then pivot if it doesn't work? Or are you testing multiple versions of these things as you go?
No, so that's such a good question. And I think it leads perfectly into us talking about campaigns in the introduction stage of the buddy system, right? Since we're talking about videos here especially, and how they impact what's going on deeper in your buddy system, deeper into your funnel.
Right.
This is a perfect way to kind of dive into that. At the agency, it's really interesting. We've seen a lot of that same kind of question pop up where we've had artists at IndieX come to us with either like previous music videos that they've released, lyric videos, things like that. Maybe they're strapped for time to create something new specific to like a spec FanFinder campaign that we're looking for them. And, we've got some creatives to test, but we're not really sure how they're going to do. So oftentimes what we do, and this is kind of outlined in the FanFinder training, is we'll run a 24-hour test of a video just to kind of see if it has some legs and what kind of cost per 75% view is certainly one KPI that we look for in those campaigns. But especially when it comes to testing things that we know aren't going to be, quite fit to what we would look for in terms of a video, we pay really close attention to kind of some more of the intangible KPIs related to the campaign. Looking at the comments. Obviously, you can calculate cost per comment if you look into the engagement metrics in your ads dashboard, but not only looking at like how many comments are coming in, how many reactions are coming to the post, shares and things like that, not only looking to the quantity of those, but also the quality of them. Are there comments coming in that are starting meaningful conversations? That's something that we look for when it comes to, running those initial tests and seeing like, is this really working? Because even if you get a cost per 75% view, that's great, 10 cents, 15 cents, whatever that looks like. Even if you get that, if you're not getting that next level engagement that's really showing that people actually care and they're just not sort of like passively watching through it and then leaving, well, then you may not have, that may not be the best metric to be paying attention to or using to say, this is a win. I don't need to try anything else. So that's something that we especially look for. And I know something you and I have talked about a lot is FanFinder campaigns that Jesse Gillenwalter's Basic Printer is used, where he sees a higher cost per 75% view than, what we would typically say is sort of your aim. But the conversations that are coming from that are like, the next level, these people are going to become my fans when they communicate with me kind of conversations.
Yeah. Well, and especially because his, I can't tell you how many emails and messages we get from indies that are like, my music is different. And it's like, yes, everyone is unique, right? So let me just put that disclaimer out there. It does not mean that these things need to apply differently to you, but it is good awareness if you're like, okay, my stuff is a little bit niche, right? Jesse's audience is a very particular kind of person. A lot of them are very interested in, live performance with synths and some, really great kind of abstract melody lines and very experimental instrumentation. So there's a definite personality style that comes with that. And so, he tends to have to pay more for these people because it's not like you're selling a country song that is, pretty much pop country, like would be on the radio and doesn't take a lot of investment. His stuff takes kind of an intellectual investment into what he's doing. So his costs are always higher, across the board. But I also know, like, I watch him, he's sending out merch every week, So the people that are coming through are engaging with him and engaging with him long term. And that's another reason why, it's just very important not to be using these random benchmarks, because in the end, Jesse is probably profiting more off of his music business than many of our indies who are getting much lower costs, even in multiple places in their funnel, so to speak. So it really isn't necessarily a gauge. And so that's why I think it's really important to be testing different elements and making sure that you are really, not just digging into your archive and finding content that you think might kind of fit the bill here. Like, you really need to put your best foot forward and, test multiple things against each other so that you can start getting a vibe of like, okay, when I'm running stuff, my benchmark is probably around here. This is the difference between these two, and this is the audience that's responding. And then keeping track of that as you progress down to see what the conversion really looks like. So it's a lot, which I think is why when we were talking about this episode, I'm like, okay, well, let's talk about the pivots. Like, if you feel like something's not doing well, what do you do? So, I kind of want to list off the FAQ that I see in our indies groups, like, all the time and kind of get Jack's like knee jerk on them. So firstly,
oh God, hot seat.
Yeah. Oh my gosh. I mean, cause there's so many. And I think a lot of people just get in the weeds with this stuff. And it's like, look, man, you're making this too complicated, right? Like, it doesn't have to be this crazy. And it's the opposite of what I just said. You should be testing things against each other, but there's also such a thing as like getting too like crazy in it, right? You don't have to test 80 variables,
Just as an example, before we go into the FAQs, I see in the indies group on Facebook, I've seen on numerous occasions throughout the past few years, people kind of citing random metrics like, oh, my reach to through plays is this, and my video percentage watched versus impressions is 7.5 3/4%. And it's just like, stop. It's just like, stop it. Those are not things that you need to be like losing sleep over.
Right.
Take a little bit more of a high level view. I know we encourage people to really get into their metrics and to care about them, but there's only certain things that you can impact when you decide to take action on pivoting a campaign. There's certain things that are just out of your control. And I think that's something that I wanted to highlight in this episode is like, if you're starting to overthink each and every metric, then that you've kind of wandered away from the path and you're kind of just, you're getting away from the point.
Yeah, it's funny because I feel as if we've really pushed a narrative of metrics and data and making data backed decisions. And we still like firmly stand by that. And I think that there are a lot of musicians we still have to make that plea to. It's like, okay, don't just go off your gut. Don't use your Spotify artist dashboard to tell you everything about what's happening, right?
For sure.
There's more critical thinking you can apply. But the problem is that if you have too much data and you've like fully embraced what we've said and you're like, I'm getting the data, like there's a point where it's like, bruh, like you gotta back off it. Like there's so much data out there that you could really get too deep in it to be actually helping yourself at some point. So hopefully we can kind of highlight some of that as we're going through this process today. So with these fan finders, one thing I see all the time, Jack, is people talking about the delivery, right? When people are looking at their fan finder, they're looking at who the demographics are that are consuming their content. And they also, and this may or may not be connected, so you can tell me, but they also talk about like, oh, I was getting great comments and now I'm getting no comments. Does that mean that the video is now failing, or is it just kind of like how it works?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So in terms of delivery, is it safe to assume that that question is loaded with, oh, there's a certain age demographic or a gender skew that I'm seeing here, and I want to know why that is and if it's something that I need to tweak? Or, for example, I know that my fans are, below 25 and I don't want anybody else to pay attention. Is that what the question is kind of getting at? Because that's something that I see a lot of as well.
I think people get really in the weeds about who they think has money and who they think doesn't, and, whether they want older people or younger people, or like people just get really ageist and sexist, and here's the thing, like my ads have always, top performer has always been this huge bump in the 18 to 24 female range. Constantly. And it's almost like if I'm looking at the delivery of it, it like bumps up in the female 18 to 24 and then decreases and then bumps up at the 45 to 54 men, right? And so that's an arc that I'm very used to seeing at this point. So since I've run thousands and thousands of dollars of ads, I can kind of I can see if something weird is happening in the platform. But if somebody's just running something for the first time, or they've been running it for a little while, but not at high volume, like, do you think they should make adjustments to these audiences? Is there a situation where, you would react because you think something different is happening? Like, how do you look at that?
Yeah, so that's such a good point, and that's what I was going to say. I think when you're in the beginning stages of building an audience, it's important to let the data just do its thing and help you find the people that are engaging with your music the most. So something that I would pay attention to if I were, let's just say running a fan finder campaign and I was seeing a skew to a couple different demographics where there was a bump in one age range and one gender group and a bump in a different one opposite, 15 years older or something like that. What I would be paying attention to then is not just those numbers from like a stereotypical what's in my head point of view. I would be looking and seeing like, okay, if I'm seeing delivery to those people, what going back to what we were saying about like more of the intangible kind of metrics is, what are the conversations like? Am I getting more engagement right now? Are people commenting? Are people sharing? What are the conversations in the comments looking like? Are there people going and checking out my page, messaging me? Because if that's the case, then what you're probably finding is that you've got people in those demographic groups that give a shit about your music and they like you. Yeah. So with that in mind, especially at the early stages of building an audience, I think that's where it's important to pay attention to and, let it do its thing because you're seeing, positive lift in other areas. I think that that's really important.
Which is why we call it a fan finder, right?
Right,
it's not
right,
like,
exactly.
Oh, make 18 to 24-year-olds like your shit. We don't name it that. We name it fan finder, and that is without an I'm an age and gender discriminator, you know?
Right. It's not a teenager conversion engine,
Right.
you know?
Yeah, young adult conversion machine. Like it's
Yeah.
called Fan Finder because it's going to find your fans. So even if they don't look like what you think they should or would look like, you know?
Yeah, for sure. And I mean, we've certainly had conversations at the agency level with clients about this in the past who, you know, they want very specific things. And what I often end up saying, especially for artists that are building for the first time and really just starting to get into the world of building an audience, is like, this is where you should be agnostic about demographics, you know, age and gender demographics. You should let the data do the work for you, because if you limit at the top of the funnel and then try to retarget and you just bomb, then you've kind of put yourself in a pickle where you don't really know why. You sort of, if you chop it off at one age range, for example, that can really hurt. Now, on that note, I do want to mention that, like, you know, in cases where if you're running top of funnel intro stage campaigns and you're seeing a crazy skew to, like, I don't know, let's just say, for example, like you're seeing a crazy skew to 55 plus and just zero engagement, nothing happening. And you're like scratching your head being like, what is going on here? Obviously you would want to look at your video and you want to look at your copy and see if what you're putting out content wise is actually compelling. But if you're seeing, you know, great cost per view, kind of like those metrics that we talk about. If you're seeing that in an age range that, you know, kind of makes you wonder, and you're not seeing any of that sort of second level engagement, then you might want to question if there's something going on, you know, that might be worth a test at chopping out that range and seeing what you can do. If you're seeing, and I know, especially recently, you were telling me just a couple days ago about something you were seeing in a campaign that you were running. So maybe you can touch on that a little bit.
Yeah. Are you talking about my ages and stuff?
Yeah.
Okay. Trigger, what were we talking about? Jack and I talk a lot, so I needed to make sure what it was. And I'm running a lot of campaigns right now. So I have always had this very predictable, you know, 18 to 24 on the female side, and then kind of a dip up at the 45 to 54 male side of my audiences for video views. And, you know, obviously, first off, I kind of want to do a disclaimer, like, we're optimizing for video views. So that doesn't, you know, you can't say like, okay, find people who will watch this video and then also do these things, right? And I have plenty of people who have purchased my merchandise that never watched that to 75%, right? I picked them up somewhere else. And that's just the nature of this beast, right? We can't even optimize for 75% video views. We can only optimize for through plays. And as far as I'm concerned, a through play is not enough to make any decision, you know? So we're kind of like trying to feed the monster one bite at a time, and it doesn't always go linearly. So what I started noticing, especially since like COVID hit and there was all this, like, you know, everyone was staying at home and there was a different kind of consumption of media happening. I started to notice that my ads were skewing almost exclusively to 45 to 65 plus male. Like 99% of what was delivering was there. And at first I was like, well, cool. Like, I have a lot of fans in that age range. But I started to notice that I was also getting some comments that I didn't like as much. Like they were either really creepy, like commenting on me physically, which is, that's an instant ban for me. I'm not into that. Or like just less engagement, lower engagement than normal. Now, it would be dumb for me to be like, oh, well, 55-year-old men and up are a bad audience. That's not the point, and they shouldn't be excluded from anywhere because of this one isolated experience with mine, right? So don't cite this as a reason to be ageist in your ads. But I have run tens of thousands of dollars of ads, and I know that it's been the same for a super long time. So I actually segmented that audience, that part of my audience out. I didn't exclude them entirely. I put them in a different portion of a different ad set. And I was like, okay, I'm still going to feed some budget to this audience because I know that, reasonable fans come out of this, but I'm not getting quite the engagement that I like. And my ad has now skewed to sending all the money there because all of these guys are giving me through plays, and that's the algorithm's job. So instead what I did is I put them in a separate ad set and excluded them from the original, made a separate ad set for them, and then put a daily limit on that ad set because I'm using campaign budget optimization. And what that allowed me to do was make sure I'm not excluding those people, but also make sure that there's budget going to not those people because it was skewed so off from what I already know about the audience that has come through this process already. So, that's a little bit more of an advanced thing, and you shouldn't jump to make that decision. You should really try to just allow the algorithm to do what it does. But that's a way that you can kind of pivot if you find that something is acting really out of the ordinary and you've been running ads for a couple of years and this is just like, whoa, out there. It's one way to manage that piece of ad set that might be acting a little bit differently from what you expect.
Totally. Yeah, that's so good. And that was exactly kind of what I was getting at, was like, if you're in a place where you know the trends because you did things open and you let the algorithm do the work and you let the campaign find your fans, you start to know the trends. So then you can make decisions down the line when those trends shift in a way that is unexpected and, weird.
Right.
And
right.
I think that kind of bared repeating because it's just important. Rather than being, stereotypical, ageist, sexist about what you're doing at the very top of the funnel, you actually are doing yourself a disservice in how you can analyze your data when you do that.
Yeah. If I hear one more or read one more comment about how 13 to 17-year-olds don't have money, I'm going to lose my marbles.
Yeah.
Because tons of my fans, as well as like in my own family, I have siblings who are in this age range and have debit cards. And I swear to God, my dad gives them an allowance that they make more than I do a month. All right. So they got plenty of ways to spend this money. And it's, so I hate generalized statements like that because I feel like 99% of the time they're wildly misinformed, if informed at all, and not just a gut reaction. So Jack, on that note, right, we keep saying like, if you've run this or if you're at a place, blah, blah, blah. So would you say that there's a certain, dollar marker or audience marker or time marker that somebody can try to, set an expectation for themselves? Like, when I hit this kind of moment, maybe I'll know enough about my audience to start making these kinds of judgments.
I don't really know if there's at least in my opinion, in my experience, I don't really know if there's a hard moment.
Of course it varies, like everything we tell everyone, which
budget wise or time wise, audience wise, I think it really varies pretty heavily. I guess I would say this: when you have if we're talking about top of funnel here, when you have a video that is predictably generating you new listeners at a good cost per 75% view, and the conversations that are happening are real and engaged as a result of that, and you're actually seeing real growth over the span of a number of months, and it's something that's happening consistently for 6 months, maybe that's a safe place to start. Saying that like, okay, I've got a handle on some of the trends that are going on. Not saying that is like I'm not putting that out there as dogma, but at that point, like if you're looking at your fan finder campaign and you say, I know this is a winner. It's doing what I intend it to do. And it's been doing that consistently for quite some time. Then I think you can start to say, okay, I'm understanding the trends, and you can look at them a little bit deeper. That would probably be like my safe tiptoeing advice when it comes to that.
Yeah, I think too it can kind of help if you're running a fan finder, right? We talk about automatic buddies all the time, right? And we talk about people who see your stuff and then they go diving and searching and really want to learn more. So for me, when I'm running new videos, even if it's to like right now, I'm running video campaigns on remix videos and on orchestral videos, and like these are essentially brand new audiences for me because I'm a rock artist, right? So, I'm hoping that my warm audience will go along with me and I'm hoping to bring in a ton of new people. So I'm still kind of starting over as far as those specific pieces of my advertising are concerned. And so one thing that I've been using to gauge, how this is going is, how many people are messaging me and getting into the next step before I run a campaign to do so. So if somebody is coming in through my video and they message me and then they buy something, that's a good indicator that this video is attracting the right kind of people, especially if it happens a dozen times, right? If you have some people commenting, but no one's really messaging you and you don't see any of that automatic progression, people like creating automatic buddies of themselves, that might be a sign that you need to give it more time or that something needs to be changed in your ads. So I think that's another helpful kind of tip, right? As you're looking at how your videos are doing, because really if it's doing well, it should be doing some of that. There should be even if it's a very small minority of the audience, there should be still some audience that is like progressing its way through on its own without you having to run an opt-in campaign.
Yeah. Yep.
Speaking of opt-in campaigns, let's move into that realm of this. I think that's enough about our top of funnel for now. So as we get into opt-ins, right, let's talk about the three things we're looking at. Again, we're looking at ad creative, we're looking at copy, and we're looking at audience. But I think another variable comes into play here. Jack.
Oh, yes.
Do you know where I'm leading with this?
Yes, I do.
All right. Well, why don't you take it away? Yeah, exactly. It's the offer
is so critically important when it comes to opt-in campaigns at the permission stage of the buddy system.
Totally.
So many times. So many. More times than I can count when I'm looking at permission stage campaigns and doing audit work. The offer is the problem so often. So that is definitely the fourth element to what you look at when you're testing and pivoting ad campaigns at this stage. So yeah, let's dive right into it.
Yeah. Well, I think the
Pandora's box.
Yeah. Oh, for sure. This is probably the hardest part. I would say that there are bigger struggles with permission than even affirmation, because I think there's a certain psychological thing like about buying that people are like, I buy things. You know what I mean? Like it's normal for them, right? Whereas like with a lot of reasons how people get onto mailing lists is like they're at some, shopping website or they're checking out a new product because they saw an ad or whatever it is. And there's like, oh, put in your email here to get 10% off your first order. And they do it and then they forget to unsubscribe, or maybe they unsubscribe right away. But it's a very utilitarian kind of vibe, right? And this doesn't mean that it's the only way people use email. It just means that, they aren't necessarily thinking about signing up for a mailing list in the same way that they think about purchasing. Like purchasing your merch is very similar to purchasing other things, whereas signing up for your mailing list is very different from signing up for other things. So when I see things in permission where people are like, here's a free download, which I mean, yeah, we don't need to cover that a million times again, because I know we've talked about it for years on this podcast, but it's like, it's not just that a download doesn't work, right? Because that's not necessarily true. It doesn't work 95% of the time, but sometimes it works, but it's like, what are you offering that's valuable? The reason why people signed up for the mailing list on that, that certain shopping site is because they were going to get 10% off the order and they intended to purchase. So that's valuable to them, right?
Definitely.
A download is not valuable to most people. Maybe there is something in your audience that makes it valuable, right? But the biggest thing with these offers is that you have to brainstorm, you have to understand your audience well enough to know what would be considered valuable to them so that you can offer them something they give a shit about instead of just being like, yeah, I'll throw you this thing and we'll be friends, you know?
Totally. Yeah. It's interesting. I think musicians face a really unique challenge, as opposed to like, your typical e-commerce stores where, like you said, people are opting in for a 10% discount or a 2-for-1 discount, or even like local businesses where people are opting in for, I don't know, for like dentists, for example, like a free teeth cleaning or any other, promotion that you might see a brick and mortar store running. Musicians face a really interesting challenge because in most cases, your free download or even worse, your sign up for my newsletter, like none of that is really utilitarian in a way that it will take people to the next step with you. So it's a challenge to come up with creative ways that you can offer your fans something in exchange for their contact info that they're actually going to give a shit about.
Right. Yeah. Not like they're doing you a favor. Like, hey guys, sign up for my email list because you love me. And like they feel the need to affirm that they love you. Like, it's okay, I love you. Here's my email. You know what I mean?
Right,
Like,
exactly.
You want it to be something where they're like, oh, tight. Yeah, I totally want that. And they just need my email so that they can send it to me. But yeah, I want that, you know?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. So offer. Got it. So sometimes it's so funny because I know Jack and I have both done audits on Indie's, live Q&A, and we've talked about these things before. And offer is something we've discussed many, many, many times on the podcast. But when I'm doing a lot of these audits, I'm not even seeing as many people sweating about their offer. They're sweating about like the color of the button on their opt-in page, right? As if that is the thing that's going to change the course of this entire campaign. Mm-hmm. And so it's not only the offer, right? Like if we go back, right, to what we're thinking about and we think about creative. Now, a cool combination of having to think about the facets of multiples of these things coming together is, okay, I've got my audience and they hopefully are warmed up. And then I've got my creative. So they came in through this fan finder, right? And so we're considering the flow of these things. How do they know you're that dude or that gal? Like, how do they know to make the connection in the creative from the fan finder to you asking them for their email? There has to be a connection, right? So the audience is really important there. And when we say the audience, we're not really meaning the targeting as much as we're saying, do they know who you are? Do they see a value in this face that's now in front of them? And so that's another portion of the audience. Another portion of the audience consideration is that maybe your audience is too small. Maybe there aren't enough people. And and this is true for almost any ad set, if you, set up an ad and it's out of preview, right? Or if it's out of review, I should say, and it's been approved and it's not spending any money, it's probably because your audience is too small and your bid is not high enough, right? If you have $1 a day feeding to your Greenlight warmth, which is a recommendation, we talked about that last week or 2 weeks ago with Greenlight warmth boosting. Yeah, your audience at $1, that could work. But if your audience is too small and they are more expensive in the auction than $1 will run for you, you won't see it fire, and you might have to increase that budget. So we see that a lot with permission campaigns as well. People trying to target a very small audience with a very low budget. And so those, I think, are the two kind of missteps in audience for permission. What do you think, Jack?
Yeah, totally. I think there's one other element to audience that's worth considering is that if you're working with a smaller audience, let's just say you're working with a 75% video views fan finder audience, and you're trying to target just those people, just that segment of your fans. If that audience isn't big enough and you're running, for example, a conversions objective in your Facebook Ads Manager, if that audience is too small, while it even might deliver, what you might find is that when you use the conversions objective, Facebook is going to look within the audience that you've given it, told it to target, and it's going to look for people that are most likely to take that objective, to become a lead in this case. So if you're working with a really small audience, or even an audience that you might consider a little bit bigger, into the the lesser thousands, what you might run into is that Facebook only determines that a handful of people in that audience are really, primed and ready to take a conversion objective. So what you'll end up seeing is a small reach and just your frequency just driving up and up and up as you spend in it. So what that leads you to look at is, how can you expand that audience? How can you make that audience bigger? And that, goes into looking back at the earlier stages of your buddy system, but also, looking into potentially changing the objective on your campaign to, optimizing for something like landing page views, or even traffic potentially, or even reach, are all things that you can look towards. So that's something else to consider with audience, just from like a technical perspective, that when you're troubleshooting campaigns is at least worth keeping in the back of your mind.
Yeah, definitely. All right, so we've got these audience factors to consider. Say that everything with the audience seems great, right? That wasn't the problem. So the only other things we have to look at are the creative, the copy, and the landing page, and the offer, right?
That's a lot of stuff.
and then. So what would be the first thing you would look at next if you're not getting opt-ins?
Okay, so the first thing that I would look at is, I would look at the ad campaign as a whole, and I would say, are people clicking this ad?
Right.
If you're not getting clicks over to your landing page, or whatever your opt-in mechanism is, I would say, okay, of the people that are clicking, am I getting any opt-ins? Am I just totally flatlined? Is this flopping altogether? Because if so, if those two things are combined, and that's why I mentioned them together, if those two things are combined, my first inclination is that you might have an offer problem.
Yeah.
If people aren't clicking in mass, and then the people that just aren't opting in, then you may have an offer problem.
Right.
Straight up.
Yeah.
If you're finding that people are clicking on your ad and you're getting a lot of clicks over to the landing page, but they're not opting in, then you may have an opt-in page issue where you need to work to optimize that, especially if your conversion rate is on that opt-in page is low. We kind of talk about the gold standard of being, between 30 and 40%. And, that can vary as well. I've seen fantastic permission stage campaigns that, perform at 15 to 20% conversion rate on the opt-in page as well. It really just depends again. But that might be where you would want to look if you're getting a lot of clicks, but you're not getting a lot of opt-ins.
Yeah, I think clicks and a lot of clicks and not a lot of opt-ins can also be an indicator of a poor offer if the offer is not clear in your ad, right?
Definitely.
If your offer is really clear in the copy or creative of your ad, and then you're not getting opt-ins, that's probably not an offer problem. That's probably an opt-in problem, right? So that's where you want to see basically, like, how are people exposed to this offer, right? And figuring out, basically, think of it as your user, right? If your audience isn't clicking, there's something going on there. It's either a problem with the ad or a problem with the audience, right? And so think of that person, like, put yourself, okay, if I am in an audience where I want something from this artist, I know who they are and I'm interested in this, right? Then, that's where you want to think about, okay, I see this offer and I click, what could throw me off on the opt-in page at that point, right? One thing that we have had to kind of troubleshoot, and, when Jesse has done tech work for the agency, he would kind of bounce things off of me. And something that we had to do was actually, we looked at the load time for one of the accounts that he was running. And because they were like, we can't figure out like why we aren't getting what we need. And I was like, you have a load time issue. People are clicking, but they're not getting the landing page view. And that's usually a good indicator that your site is freaking slow and you need to get some of those images or videos off of there or figure out why it's running so slow. And I think that's something that a lot of people don't think about either, but like, this is again where we're visiting, like, tweaking the color of the button on your landing page is not going to be the thing. Are green buttons better for opt-ins? Sure. But we're also not selling products here, right? You should have done most of the work before they even get to the page. So at that point, your button color is not the thing.
Definitely. Yeah. And I think you made a good point about, if people are getting to the landing page and not opting in, it may be a combination of an opt-in page issue or an offer issue. The two they start to meld together. And that was something that I kind of wanted to touch on in this episode, is like, these things don't exist in a vacuum. These metrics and these ideas don't exist in a vacuum. They meld, they really meld together.
Right.
Your opt-in page problem that we're talking about here, your conversion rate issue, might be down to the fact that your offer is just not strong and it's not presented as such on the opt-in page.
Right. Yeah.
Or just that the benefits aren't made, very obvious and explicit. That's super important.
Or that they have to scroll down the page for 10 minutes to even find the button to do it. They may have come to that page and been like, I'm ready. And then they're like, but where is it? And they have to scroll through all your blather that they didn't care. They were already ready. You're selling snow to a snowman. He's like, I'm good. Just where do I sign? You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And I think that's something that I see a lot with opt-in pages, is that give them something right at the top that's like, ready to go? Here you go. Want more? Scroll down.
Totally. Yeah. That's something that I say often and talk about often with clients, is like, this above the fold space. We don't need to waste that with putting your social handles or your logo really big or a giant promo photo of you. That's not important. That real estate is specifically meant for people who are going to take action right away because they saw your ad and they said, hell yeah, I want that. And they click on it. Now, everything below that is meant for the people that need a little bit more convincing.
I think too that makes a good point about the amount of weight that is on the original audience and the ad, right? Because if you are saying, hey, Corinne, great, but people don't know enough about my offer to click a button right at the top, then you're doing it wrong. Because
Yep.
if you have to wait for people to get to the opt-in page before they can even consider this, first off, that's going to hurt your clicks. It's going to hurt your click-through rate because people are like, okay, this is vague. Do I care? All right, well, I guess I might go look, So the offer should be at least clear-cut enough where if somebody is into what you're doing and they don't need to be sold on it, they can click the button at the top of the page. And so I think that that's something I identify a lot too when I'm doing these audit sessions, is that people are like, well, like if I put the button at the top, like they don't even, like I'm not going to put a button up there because they don't really know what it is. And it's like, well, then you haven't done it right. Because
Totally, yeah.
you can't rely on that opt-in page to do all the selling for you because you got to get them there in the first place, So I think that's something else to really consider when you're looking at how you're building the opt-in page. That kind of objection is something that I hear a lot.
Yeah, definitely. And that, that looks at going back a step to your ad, looking at your ad creative. Does it get people's attention? Are you putting in the messaging of your ad copy why they should care about this? What's desirable about what you're offering them, and what's the next step that they have to take to do it?
Right.
In addition to what you were saying about, connecting your ad creative to what they've seen of you previously, it's also meant, the copy essentially is meant to pre-frame them into what the future step is.
Right, exactly. Yeah. So I think that that's kind of a good outline of lots of opt-in things. I think I would like to touch on affirmation before we, wrap this up for today. So affirmation it's funny because it actually has a lot of similarities to the things we're talking about with permission campaigns, right? Who's the audience? Are they primed for this? Is the ad clear? Do they know what they're, going to look for when they click that button? Is the page clear? Do you have an opportunity for them to, check out immediately, or do they have to read a bunch of stuff or like navigate through a cart, right? How efficient is that process? And so there's a lot of things that are very similar. So Jack, what would you say are the biggest differences?
I would say the biggest differences actually they come a little bit from the previous stage, right? Like the previous stage of the buddy system. What leading into a sales offer were people exposed to that would even, make them a candidate to be a sales offer? And that's an audience thing, right? If you're going after audiences that just haven't really engaged with you on a deep level, and you're advertising a sale to them, you're skipping steps. So that's one thing I think that's really important, just kind of off the top here, is look at your audience. Who are you making the offer to? I think that's really important.
Yeah, definitely. I agree. I think that's, a lot of people might move into this a little too soon. And here's the thing, we're talking about paid stuff, but there's also a lot of organic support that needs to be coming from all of this, right? Like you need to be talking about people with this stuff on socials. You need to be, maybe it's advantageous for you to do a live stream, do an unboxing, do an unveiling. You should be talking to your email list a lot about whenever you're creating new things. And it's really advantageous if you do these things while this stuff is in production, especially with your warmest audience. If you're like, this is coming and I'm excited and I'm not trying to sell it to you right now, but I want to tell you about it because like, look at all the cool things I'm putting into it, or look at, some details about it that aren't necessarily a sales conversation. It's just like, jamming with them about how your artistry is flowing into something tangible. So there's a lot of other work that needs to happen that doesn't have to cost you money, right? And also helps your money be more efficient once you get these ads going. So that's another consideration, I think, that some indies take for granted. They think, oh, well, I'll feed them a video ad and then I'll feed them a permission ad and then I'll feed them a buy ad and we're good. It's like,
no, doesn't work like that.
Yeah, no, you don't want your entire relationship with your fans to be centered around ads. I mean, here at Indepreneur, we are obviously very pro ads, and we know that advertising is an investment that you really need to make, right? Organic is not going to get you there on its own, but it's still very, very important as a support structure for the ads that you're running. So Jack, when we're talking about affirmation, right, which is getting that first sale from an audience, what are the kind of things that you're strategizing on the IndieX level for people who have not made those sales or are generating new people that have yet to make their first purchase?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So there are a couple things. One is, having in your ecosystem, in your tech stack, some kind of dedicated offer that can be made to fans that are going through the permission stage. I know this is kind of, rudimentary buddy system talk now, right? But having some kind of dedicated offer, and I'm making this clear because I do see indies that, will run opt-in campaigns, and then on the back end, they just say, oh, I'm just going to make a merch offer and send people to our store.
Yeah. Guys, if it ever feels like we're harping on something, it's not because we think you're stupid. It's not because we think you just need to hear it 50,000 times. It's because we saw someone yesterday who didn't get it. And so that's why we continue to drive a lot of these points home, is that like we're responding directly to indies who are asking those questions yesterday, the day before, and today. So if you're like, I get it, it's like, well, but not everybody gets it. And as a community, we have to succeed. So, I think that, again, just drilling that stuff home is really important, right? Because obviously there are some people who still don't get it, and we want all these people to succeed,
Totally, yeah. So with that in mind, having, a dedicated offer for affirmation, I think is really, really useful. It removes the paradox of choice that you present these new fans who are excited about something that they're experiencing with you. It removes that that overwhelm, which is really important, and it drives them through, a very specific funnel. So that's one thing that I would say, if you're struggling with affirmation and you don't have some kind of dedicated offer in place, get one in there. That's point number one. Point number two, I think when I think about affirmation, especially with our agency clients, is something to keep in mind is oftentimes your permission campaign is leading people to a point of affirmation, right? You're trying to maybe recoup all or some of the ad spend that you're putting out to get those opt-ins, which is great. That's really, really good. Keep that in mind that, ads aren't your only point of offer exposure.
Right.
You collected those emails for a reason. So make sure that you're, taking advantage of that channel and being willing to increase your offer exposure in that channel. I've often audited, launch funnels, album launch funnels, where the sales offer is made once, which is just, and this is getting outside of the realm of ads and more into the realm of email marketing, but it's all one ecosystem. So, look at where are your points of offer exposure, how often is it happening, and where is it working and where isn't it working? Where are people raising their hand and taking the sale versus where are they not? I often look at it as the ad campaign portion of affirmation more as like a subtle reminder, a way to reach the people that, maybe didn't open their emails, or display excitement about what you're doing in a way that you can't in an email. So that might be like you said, Corinne, like an unboxing video.
Yeah.
That might be, an announcement type video. Those sorts of things can work really, really well because there's a personality attached to it. So when it comes to auditing and testing and pivoting in your affirmation ad campaigns, I would look at your creative and say, like, is this just another sales offer, or does this ad give somebody a reason to engage with it? Are they going to watch this and actually get excited about it, or is it just a picture of a t-shirt?
Right. Yeah, totally. I mean, I think I like how you say that advertising is really more of a reminder, right? It's not where you make the initial offer, and you don't rely on it fully to do this for you. Right. Which is why, this would be one of the exceptions in Greenlight Warmth Boosting, where you might go for a different objective than engagement, or maybe not, when you release a new piece of merch, right? You post it organically and maybe you boost it a little bit before you start diving into hardcore conversion ads. That might just not be the next logical step. And in this, again, this is also talking about when I was, referencing my membership for this current release, and sending ads to people who are currently members and sending it to them only, just to be like, hey, did you see this new thing that's in the membership area that's, only for you to see, so that they continue to engage over there. This is true with merchandise as well, right? If people aren't constantly going to your store and they're not the type of fan that's just going to always be looking for the latest thing from you, this is a great way to let them know, like, hey, there's this thing that I was telling you about. It's available now, but it's in a more natural kind of conversation, right? You don't have to feel like you're an evangelist and trying to convert them into customers, Totally, it doesn't have to be that intense. It can just be like, hey, we had this conversation already and here's, the layup for it. So I think that's something that's, a really great point to make, is that really ads don't have to be this hardcore conversion if it's the kind of merch that you've already been talking about with your fan base and emailing them consistently about the process of creation and, these different components of it that are far more of an interest point than a sales conversation.
Yeah, totally. And that leads me to an example from IndieX that I think would be helpful for our listeners to hear about when it comes to affirmation. And this is looking at long-term affirmation, right? Because likely when you're running an opt-in funnel of any kind, and you're making an offer at the end. There are going to be people who take the offer and they love it and they affirm and they move into that stage of the buddy system. And there's going to be people who just, they're not there yet. Either it just didn't connect with them. It's not something that they're into, and that's fine. You continue to nurture that relationship with them. So my point here is that you want to continue to innovate and find ways to make offers to those fans. We talk about this all the time, and I bang my head on my desk all the time, telling indies to mail their list and to make offers and to run sales. And that goes without saying. But the example that I wanted to talk about was with one of our IndieX clients, with Dave Pettigrew, who we've had on this podcast, and I know we've talked about quite often.
He just does things so well. It's impossible not to talk about Dave.
I always want to brag on Dave.
Dude, and I want to highlight that Dave came in like when the Indiepreneur site was still on ClickFunnels, right? And before Indie Pro ever launched. And he bought that training and he executed himself, And he's highly involved. He's working throughout the week, every week, doing live streams every week, like developing merch constantly. He was touring constantly until, we couldn't be touring right now. But like, it's hard not to brag on Dave. And if you want to watch an artist who is just doing the most, but in a really good way, and not thirsty, but just really doing it well, Dave's the guy to look at, right? So anyway, sorry, Jack. I hate to cut you off. I want you to know that he started out just working his butt off, and he still does it, even though he's got the agency in tow, which is what makes him so powerful. So it's his own drive that really achieves that.
Totally. Yeah. It's such a good point to make. We work with all sorts of artists at IndieX, and Dave is one of those standout artists that I get to work with personally, who he's putting in just as much work as we are.
He's probably listening to this episode right now to see if there's anything new to learn. I mean?
Exactly.
Hi, Dave. But like, he's the guy. He'll just never stop. So anyway, I just had to shout him out a little bit and point out that work ethic and that drive is really why he's successful more than anything.
The sales offer that was really interesting that he ran last summer, and it was a little bit more of a high ticket offer. However, there were people who got involved with it that hadn't purchased from him yet, which is really interesting. And the way he did it kind of goes into what you were talking about earlier, Corinne, about walking through the process of creating your offers with your fans. One of the things that this offer was specifically, he took some of his fans in for a studio session with him. It was like, I think it was like a $99 product, and
cool.
he offered it to his fans. And the way that he did it was really coy. We just sent out a few different email campaigns, and he announced it on his live stream. So we're tapping into, the nurturing and the education stages of the buddy system here. And he said to his fans, "Hey, I'm thinking about doing this thing where I invite you guys into the studio. Would you be interested in that? I'm kicking the tires in my brain a little bit and deciding if this is something cool. Do you think this would be cool?" People raised their hand and said, "Yes, it would be cool. How do we make it happen?" And then
do you think this is cool? Show me by buying it. Right.
Right.
Like Gracie Phillips, who is just a great singer-songwriter, and I think she would categorize herself as like Americana folk. I'm not sure, but she's amazing. She does great live streams. She's at a very grassroots level. She works in Indiepreneur as one of our support specialists. You may have spoken with her, but she once, I was like, I really feel like you should like develop a membership. I was like, even if it's just small, even if it just starts with 1 or 2 tiers from the get-go and has a free version available. And so she did a ton of work like in PD last week, working out these different tiers. And she showed them to me on Tuesday, her PD day. And she was like, "What do you think about these?" And I think these are great. And she was like, "Well, I think I want to launch it around here." And I was like, "Have you asked your fans about it? Like, have you emailed them, what they think about it?" And she was, I don't think she had considered that it was okay to just ask them. Like, she felt like she had to put in all the work and take the risk of building it and seeing if they came. you know?
Yeah,
And I was like, no, ask them, you know, because not only is it this is one of those things we're talking about where you don't have to say, I have this thing available. Do you want it? You can say, hey, I'm thinking about this. What do you think? They get to express their opinion about it, which not only helps you figure out and gauge their interest level, but it also allows you to, you know, make that conversation happen before you're trying to sell them anything, right?
Totally.
Jesse,
Yeah.
Basic Printer's been doing that as well with he's like looking at these different products for his upcoming album. And he's like, do you guys like want vinyl? Like, is that something? Right. And vinyl's a big purchase. They're expensive. They don't have the margins that CDs do. Right. And there's usually a relatively large minimum order for that, you know, $800 plus kind of thing.
Yeah.
And so like, why spend that money and then see if people buy it? Right. So that is something that I think just again goes back to what Jack was saying, that the ads for that will really be more of a reminder than it will be the initial time that someone sees that offer.
Totally. Yeah. I think Affirmation, especially after the first offer that you've made, for the people who, you know, are hanging out on your list and you're trying to convert them into a customer for the first time, I think Affirmation it can get away from this idea of if you build it, they will come, and move into if you ask them, they will tell you if they like it.
For sure.
And that's really powerful. Customer research is a crazy thing. So when it comes to Affirmation, I think being able to lean on that and lean on your fans in all of the stages of the buddy system that you've built up so far, is really, really important to, you know, kind of multi-use those channels. So when we're talking about Affirmation campaigns, we're not necessarily just talking about ad campaigns here. We're talking about, you know, a full marketing campaign that utilizes multiple channels. So it's you know, it's tough to pinpoint specifically in an ad campaign what may or may not be working, because also you should be tapping into other channels that hopefully will be, you know, supporting the ad campaign, and the ad campaign will be supporting it.
Right. And that's where I think more of the pivoting in an Affirmation or Ascension, right? These purchase focused phases of the buddy system, the pivots that happen are really more of what's happening organically. You're touching base with these fans. You're asking them what they want. So it's kind of like the anti-pivot, right? You don't have to pivot because you already did the research to figure out if they would be into it. If they're like, I'm into it, of course, like you have to wait until they, you know, put their money where their mouth is. Like a lot of people might be like, I would love that. And then they'll never buy it. Right. There's going to be people like that. But if there's an overwhelmingly positive response, it may even be something that they don't purchase immediately when it comes out, but they save up and purchase it further down the road because just financially it doesn't make sense for them, or, you know, and it keeps you in their mind, right, as a potential purchase. So, you know, I think a lot of the majorities in Affirmation should be coming from your organic outreach with your fans, as well as, you know, gauging their interest as you talk with them about different products or different things going on in your career. And then the Affirmation, you know, I actually mostly run retargeting campaigns for people who fell on the page and then, you know, didn't buy for some reason. I'm more worried about retargeting campaigns than I am about initial purchase campaigns. You know?
Right.
Nobody hears from me that a new product is available from an ad. That don't happen. Period.
Totally. I think in addition to, you know, talking about kind of like the multi-channel approach to Affirmation and how to make your pivots there, and, you know, along with in any ads that you're running, is there a reason that people would even want to pay attention to those ads, or is it just a boring looking product ad?
Right.
One thing that you can look to, and we've kind of touched on this with Permission as well, is looking at your offer. What are you actually offering, and is it valuable? If you've talked to your fans about it and it seemed like it was something that they were interested in, is your messaging behind it actually portraying how valuable it actually is? You know, is it just a CD, you know, or is it a CD with all sorts of things and value attached to it? That's just kind of like a boilerplate example. But I think that it is important to look at your offer and say, like, well, did I really not add on as much to this as I possibly could have? Did I not stack the offer?
Right. Exactly. Yeah. And just making sure that it's something that is worth it. But making sure. And again, so really when we're talking about all this organic support for affirmation, we're going back to the audience, really. How warm are they on this idea, right? How much do they know about this coming? Can they see it coming from far away? Have you already talked about it? Did you do your research? So that's still like an audience thing. You know what I mean? So hopefully by the time you get to the point where you're running an ad for this, you've already fleshed out the audience thing, and it's not a variable that you need to consider when you're running the ad. When you're running the ad, it's more about, like Jack's saying, is the offer good? Does it deliver on the thing that you initially were talking to them about? Did you make it special, right? If you talk to them about, hey, I'm considering vinyl, what do you think about that? And they're like, hell yeah, I'd buy vinyl. It's like, okay, does the ad say what's cool about that vinyl and what's special about it? In case they missed the email and they told you they like vinyl, but then they didn't open the email that says what's cool about it. Are you making sure that it says it's cool in the copy? Is it a video of you showing them how cool it is, right? Not just a picture of the vinyl. Does the page that they land on make it very clear how much it is, what it is, and what's cool about it? Those are the things that it's still, you don't have to worry about the audience if you are warming them up beforehand. And it'll make your ad campaigns more successful because affirmation and ascension campaigns, like product sales campaigns, can be very frustrating and very costly. And sometimes you have to run a significant budget on them before you really know that it's failing if you haven't done that audience prep first.
Definitely. Yeah. It's like we said, the ad is really just, it should be treated as one part of your affirmation strategy. Whether it's, the first time that you're making an offer to your first batch of first time customers, there's a lot of firsts there. Or if it's or if it's a follow-up sales offer to the people who just, have been hanging out. That's a really holistic way to view it, I think. And I think that when indies tap into that and get creative with it, that's where you're going to see success.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I think just, the conversations that happen with these fans directly, like in your emails, you should be asking people not just to respond to whatever you're emailing them about, but like welcoming them to chat with you. Right. If they have thoughts about stuff, or like in a lot of my emails, I will just pop at the bottom, like, how's your life? What are you doing in quarantine? Right. That's actually, I was recently interviewed on a blog, or I was a guest blogger, actually, I guess is what it was called. And I shared with them some of the things that I'm doing in quarantine. And then, now I have a follow-up to that that's like, hey, message me what you're doing in quarantine, and it's literally, that's it. There's no other call to action except, hey, if you want to tell me about what you're doing, like, let's talk. Have you seen any new movies, TV, listening to new music? Because help a girl out. I am bored, and I'm not actually bored, because entrepreneur is a thing. But as far as
don't get the wrong idea, guys.
right, exactly. I'm just lounging around over here. But that said, that is a perfect way to open a conversation, and you just never know what's going to come out of that, including a discussion about a product, right? So I think that it's funny because we talk so much about ads, but it has to be, like Jack's saying, this full scope kind of coverage so that that you're, bringing up all the important points before people have to decide whether to part with their dollars.
Totally. It often seems like as you go deeper and deeper into your buddy system, hopefully the less you need to rely on ads alone to do the work for you. They just become a bigger part of thing, or a part of a bigger whole.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, totally. So I think this is a great place to kind of stop for now. Next week, we're going to talk about planning a launch. And I mean, you're like, well, yeah.
Ooh.
But, obviously we have the ultimate album launch training. And that is one formula for a launch, right? But at the same time, we see lots of alternate launches. I know Jack has run tons of different, things that have nothing to do with the ultimate album launch format of things. And so I really wanted to talk about, how we look at these offers, how we look at these audiences, how you plan out your tech stack, right? Which for some of us is the fun part. And for some of us is like, oh, really? So but planning that out and figuring out, whether it's a single, whether it's an EP, whether it's a album, whether it's a merch item, whether it's a membership, right? What are the different things we can look at when we're launching this? How do we plan this months in advance so that the actual launch itself doesn't have to be that stressful? And I'm definitely excited to talk about that because I know, Jack, you've run a lot of alternate kind of launches. Have you not?
Totally. Yeah. Often.
He's like, yeah, duh.
Very, very often.
Right. All the time. Every week.
I'm really looking forward to going into it. I think it's going to be a super fun episode.
Absolutely. Well, thanks so much for joining us this week, Indies. I'm looking forward to seeing you next week where we'll be digging into launches. Have a great one.
Thanks so much, Indies. If you are in a place where you've listened to this episode and you're wondering about taking your music marketing to the next level and maybe you need a little bit of help, or you're working with an artist who's a bigger indie that might need some help making a bigger splash, we are opening up some slots at the Indie X agency. So if you're interested in hearing more about what Indie X is all about, you can check us out over at indepreneur.io/services, and we'll leave the link to that page in the show notes as well.
All right, Indies, thanks so much.
Can y'all really feel us? East Coast, feel us, West Coast.